The mining station Kepler 442b hummed with the constant vibration of industrial machinery. Deep beneath the surface of the rocky planet, human and alien workers labored side by side in the dimly lit tunnels, extracting precious metals that would fuel the growing interstellar economy. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of heated rock, but for most workers, it was just another day in the endless cycle of dig, haul, and process. Sarah Chun wiped sweat from her forehead as she guided the massive drilling equipment through another section of the mineral-rich wall. Her small frame belied the strength she had developed over 3 years of mining work, and her steady hands had earned her a reputation as one of the most reliable operators on the station. The other human workers respected her quiet competence, while most of the alien species she worked alongside had learned to appreciate her efficiency and fairness. Most, but not all. The Zarkonian workers were different. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with thick, armored skin that resembled granite, they had been hired by the mining consortium for their natural strength and resistance to the harsh underground conditions. Their 4 arms could move tons of rock with ease, and their ability to work in high-temperature environments made them valuable assets. However, their culture placed enormous emphasis on physical dominance and viewed smaller species as inherently inferior. Krextor was the worst of them. The largest Zarkonian on the station, he had made it clear from his first day that he considered humans to be weak parasites who had somehow tricked their way into positions they didn't deserve. He particularly despised Sarah, whose role as a drill operator put her in charge of work assignments for his sector. The fact that a human female, barely reaching his lower chest even when standing straight, could give him orders was a constant source of rage. Sarah had tried to maintain professional relations despite his obvious hostility. She gave clear instructions, stayed out of his way when possible, and documented every interaction in case formal complaints became necessary. The station's management preferred to ignore interpersonal conflicts as long as productivity remained high, and Sarah knew that causing trouble could cost her the job she desperately needed. The incident began during the afternoon shift change. Sarah was reviewing the day's extraction reports when she noticed discrepancies in the ore quality measurements from Krextor's section. The readings suggested he had been mixing lower-grade material with premium deposits, artificially inflating his productivity numbers while potentially contaminating valuable shipments. She approached him at his workstation, where he was using all 4 arms to sort through chunks of extracted rock. His massive head turned toward her as she approached, and she could see the familiar look of disdain in his small, dark eyes. "Krextor, I need to discuss the quality reports from your section," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady and professional. "The purity readings are inconsistent with the geological surveys." The Zarkonian straightened to his full height, using his size to intimidate. "You question my work, little human?" "I'm questioning the data," Sarah replied calmly. "The numbers don't match what we should be finding in this deposit layer. If there's a problem with the equipment or the testing protocols, we need to identify it." Krextor's 4 hands clenched into fists. "You accuse me of incompetence?" "I'm trying to solve a technical problem," Sarah said. "The ore quality affects everyone's safety and the station's profitability. If we're missing something, we need to figure out what it is." Other workers had begun to notice the confrontation. Humans and several other alien species stopped their tasks to watch, while the other Zarkonians moved closer to their colleague. Sarah could feel tension building in the confined space, but she held her ground. "Show me your sorting process," she said. "Maybe we can identify where the discrepancy is occurring." Krextor's response was a low growl that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "I do not take orders from weak creatures who should not be here." "This isn't about orders," Sarah said, fighting to keep frustration out of her voice. "It's about doing the job correctly. The mining consortium expects accurate quality reports, and my responsibility is to ensure we meet those standards." "Your responsibility," Krextor snarled, "is to stay out of the way of real workers." The Zarkonian turned back to his sorting, deliberately dismissing Sarah. But she couldn't let the matter drop. The quality discrepancies were significant enough to trigger automatic reviews from the consortium's oversight department, and if the problem wasn't resolved quickly, it could result in work stoppages and investigations that would hurt everyone on the station. I need to see your sorting methodology, Sarah insisted, stepping closer to the work area. If there's a systematic issue, we can address it together. Krextor spun around with surprising speed for such a large creature. His forearms spread wide in an obvious threat display, and his voice carried a dangerous edge. You dare to persist in questioning me? Sarah stood her ground, though she could feel her heart rate increasing. I'm doing my job. The same job the mining consortium pays me to do. Quality control is part of that responsibility. Quality control? Krextor's laugh was harsh and grating. You speak of quality? You are a weak, soft creature from a weak, soft species. You have no place in real work. The other Zarkonians had formed a semicircle behind their colleague, while the human workers and other aliens watched with growing concern. Sarah realized that this had moved beyond a simple workplace disagreement into something much more dangerous. My species built the faster-than-light drives that brought us all here, Sarah said quietly. We developed the extraction technology you're using and the life support systems that keep this station habitable. If you want to question our capabilities, you might want to consider where you'd be without human engineering. Krextor's small eyes blazed with fury. Human engineering? You create machines because you are too weak to do real work with your own hands. You hide behind technology because you cannot survive in the real world. Technology is how intelligence improves survival, Sarah replied. Every species develops tools. The question is whether you're smart enough to use them effectively. The insult hit home. Zarkonians prided themselves on their physical prowess, but their technology was primitive compared to human achievements. They had been uplifted to interstellar civilization by other species and relied heavily on imported equipment and expertise. Sarah's comment struck at a deep cultural insecurity. Krextor took a step forward, his massive bulk casting a shadow over Sarah. You think your clever words protect you, small human? I think my work speaks for itself, Sarah said. My section has the highest productivity and the best safety record on the station. Your section has quality control issues that need to be addressed. My section produces more or than any 3 human teams combined. Quantity without quality is worthless. The consortium pays premium rates for high-grade, or they can review the quality protocols and determine the best way to resolve the discrepancies. No, Krextor growled. This ends here. You have questioned my competence and insulted my capabilities. This requires a response. Sarah felt a chill of real fear. Zarkonians settled disputes through physical confrontation, and station regulations had unfortunately vague provisions about cultural accommodation that might protect him from serious consequences. Meanwhile, she was alone except for the watching workers, none of whom seemed inclined to intervene in what looked like it might become a violent confrontation. Violence won't solve the quality control issues, Sarah said, taking a half-step backward. And it won't change the data. Krextor reached to his equipment belt and withdrew a small metal cylinder. Sarah recognized it as a standard-issue acid applicator used for dissolving mineral deposits that were too hard for mechanical extraction. In the hands of a Zarkonian, whose natural acid resistance allowed them to work with the dangerous substance, it was a useful tool. In the current context, it was a weapon. You speak of human superiority, Krextor said, his voice now deadly calm. Let us test human endurance. Sarah's mind raced through her options, her vision blurred from the shock, but she forced herself to remain standing. Krextor watched with satisfaction, clearly expecting her to collapse or flee. The other Zarkonians rumbled their approval, while the human workers looked on in horror. Several started forward to help, but stopped when the other Zarkonians moved to block their path. Now you understand, Krextor said. This is what happens when weak creatures forget their place. Sarah looked down at her arm. The acid had burned through her coveralls and was eating into her skin, leaving a growing patch of raw, burned tissue. The pain was excruciating, but underneath the agony, something else was building. Something that had been growing through 3 years of tolerating Krextor's constant disrespect and intimidation. Rage. Pure, clean, focused rage that pushed the pain into the background and sharpened her thinking to a razor's edge. Sarah raised her head and met Krextor's eyes with a stare that made the massive alien take an involuntary step backward. You made a mistake, she said quietly. Krextor's confidence wavered slightly. He had expected her to crumple, to beg, to show the submission his culture demanded. Instead, she was standing straighter despite her obvious injury, and there was something in her expression that he didn't recognize. "Your mistake," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "was thinking that pain would make me afraid of you." She began walking toward him, her acid-burned arm hanging at her side, but her stride steady and purposeful. Krextor raised the acid applicator again, but Sarah didn't slow down. "You want to know about human endurance?" Sarah asked. "Let me show you." The watching workers, both human and alien, stared in amazement as the small human woman approached the towering Zarkonian who had just attacked her with acid. Her left arm was visibly damaged, acid still eating at the exposed skin, but she showed no sign of backing down. Krextor squeezed the applicator again, sending another stream of acid towards Sarah's face. This time she was ready. She ducked under the stream and continued forward, closing the distance between them with grim determination. "Impossible," Krextor muttered, his confidence cracking. "You should be down. You should be finished." Sarah was close enough now to see the uncertainty in his small eyes. "You don't understand humans very well," she said. "Pain doesn't stop us. It focuses us." She was within arm's reach now, and Krextor raised his massive fists to strike her down. But Sarah had spent 3 years studying Zarkonian anatomy and behavior, learning their strengths and weaknesses in case this day ever came. Their size and armor made them nearly invulnerable to most attacks, but their joints were necessarily more flexible and therefore more vulnerable. Their reliance on physical dominance meant they rarely developed sophisticated fighting techniques, and their arrogance made them underestimate opponents they considered inferior. Sarah feinted to her right, drawing Krextor's strike, then pivoted on her left foot and drove her right elbow up into the nerve cluster just below his lower left shoulder joint. The Zarkonian roared in pain and surprise as his entire left side went numb, 2 of his 4 arms dropping uselessly to his side. But Sarah wasn't finished. As Krextor staggered from the unexpected attack, she grabbed the acid applicator from his weakened grip and stepped back just far enough to avoid his wild swing with his remaining functional arm. "You want to see human superiority?" Sarah asked, raising the applicator. "Here's a lesson in tactical thinking." Krextor's eyes widened as he realized his situation. With 2 arms paralyzed and his weapon in his opponent's hands, his overwhelming physical advantages had suddenly become irrelevant. The other Zarkonians moved forward to help their colleague, but Sarah's voice stopped them. "One more step, and your friend gets the same treatment he gave me," she said, her finger on the applicator's trigger. "Except I'm not aiming for his arm." The Zarkonians froze, uncertain how to respond to a situation their culture had never prepared them for. They had assumed human weakness would ensure easy victory, and the idea that their most intimidating colleague could be defeated by someone half his size challenged everything they believed about the natural order. Krextor tried to speak, but only managed a strangled growl. The nerve strike had affected his vocal cords as well as his arms, leaving him temporarily mute and largely helpless. Sarah studied his massive form, noting how the proud stance had crumbled into something approaching fear. The other workers watched in silent fascination as the small human woman held the huge alien at her mercy with his own weapon. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "You're going to report to Station Medical for treatment of your temporary paralysis. Then, you're going to report to Station Management and request a transfer to a different sector. If you ever threaten me or any other worker again, what just happened to your arms will seem like a gentle massage compared to what I do next." Krextor managed a weak nod, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. The other Zarkonians looked uncertain whether to help him or distance themselves from his humiliation. Sarah lowered the acid applicator but didn't release it. "And one more thing. The quality control issues in your sector will be resolved by following proper sorting protocols. If you have questions about those protocols, you'll ask politely and professionally. Are we clear?" Another nod from Krextor, who was beginning to regain some feeling in his paralyzed limbs. Sarah turned to address the watching crowd. "Anyone else have concerns about human weakness they'd like to discuss?" The silence was absolute. Even the constant hum of machinery seemed muted in the aftermath of the confrontation. Finally, one of the human workers stepped forward. "Sarah, your arm needs medical attention." Sarah looked down at the acid burn, which had stopped spreading but was still painful and would require treatment. "Yeah, it does. But first I need to file a report about this incident." She looked back at Krextor, who was slowly flexing his fingers as sensation returned to his arms. Assault with a dangerous chemical. Workplace intimidation. Violation of safety protocols. This is going to generate quite a bit of paperwork. The Zarkonian's eyes showed a flash of his old anger, but it was quickly suppressed by the realization that his position on the station was now extremely precarious. Sarah held all the cards, and both of them knew it. As the crowd began to disperse, and normal work activities gradually resumed, Sarah walked toward the medical bay with steady steps. Her left arm throbbed with every heartbeat, and she knew the acid burn would leave permanent scars. But she also knew that something fundamental had changed on the mining station. The other workers, both human and alien, looked at her with new respect. The Zarkonians kept their distance and avoided eye contact, while the humans seemed to stand a little straighter. Word would spread quickly through the station about what had happened, and Sarah suspected her days of dealing with intimidation and disrespect were over. The medical bay was a small but well-equipped facility designed to handle the various injuries that occurred in mining operations. Dr. Yates, the station's chief medical officer, was an experienced trauma physician who had seen everything from cave-ins to equipment malfunctions. "What happened?" he asked as Sarah entered, immediately noticing the acid damage to her arm. "Workplace accident," Sarah said carefully. "Chemical exposure during mining operations." Dr. Yates began examining the wound, his expression growing more serious as he assessed the damage. "This isn't from standard mining chemicals. This is concentrated industrial acid. How did you get exposed to this?" Sarah met his eyes steadily. "I'll provide a full report to station management. Right now, I just need medical treatment." The doctor nodded and began preparing neutralization treatments. "This is going to hurt, but we need to stop any further tissue damage and begin repair procedures." As Dr. Yates worked on her arm, Sarah reflected on what had just occurred. The physical pain was manageable, but the implications of the confrontation would ripple through the station for weeks or months to come. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and there would be consequences beyond the immediate satisfaction of putting Krextor in his place. The mining consortium would investigate the incident, and while Sarah was confident she had acted in self-defense, corporate politics were always complicated. Some executives might view the confrontation as evidence of poor management and worker relations, potentially leading to policy changes that could affect everyone on the station. More immediately, the Zarkonians would not forget what had happened. Their culture was built around hierarchical dominance, and Sarah's victory over Krextor challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural order. They might accept her authority for now, but resentment would simmer beneath the surface. On the other hand, the human workers and other alien species had seen that Zarkonian intimidation could be successfully resisted. That might encourage others to stand up for themselves, or it might lead to escalating conflicts as various groups tested the new dynamics. Dr. Yates finished applying the neutralization treatment and began preparing skin grafts for the most severely damaged areas. "You're going to have significant scarring," he told her. "The acid penetrated deep enough to damage multiple tissue layers. I can minimize the cosmetic impact, but you'll always have marks from this." "That's fine," Sarah said. "Scars are just proof that you survived something that tried to stop you." The doctor paused in his work to look at her more carefully. "Most people would be traumatized by this kind of assault. You seem remarkably calm." Sarah considered her response. "I've been expecting something like this for a long time. When it finally happened, it was almost a relief to stop wondering when the other shoe would drop." Dr. Yates resumed his treatment, but Sarah could see him processing her words. As the station's medical officer, he was trained to watch for psychological trauma as well as physical injuries, and her reaction to the acid attack was outside the normal range of responses. "Would you like me to prescribe pain medication?" he asked. "This type of burn typically causes significant discomfort for several weeks." "Just enough to let me function," Sarah replied. "I need to stay alert and focus for the next few days while this gets sorted out. The medical treatment took nearly 2 hours, during which time Sarah noticed an unusual amount of activity in the corridors outside the medical bay. Workers were moving in small groups, talking in hushed voices, and several times she saw Zarkonians walking quickly past the medical bay windows without looking inside. When Dr. Yates finally finished, Sarah's left arm was wrapped in advanced healing bandages that would accelerate tissue regeneration while preventing infection. The immediate pain had been reduced to a manageable level, though she could still feel the deep ache of damaged tissue. "I want to see you again in 48 hours, Dr. Yates said. "If there are any signs of infection or complications, come back immediately. And, Sarah, whatever happened out there, be careful. This kind of injury suggests you're involved in something dangerous." Sarah nodded and left the medical bay, walking back through the mining station with her bandaged arm prominent for everyone to see. The reaction was immediate and obvious. Human workers nodded respectfully as she passed, while most aliens stepped aside to give her clear passage. The few Zarkonians she encountered looked away entirely, unwilling to meet her eyes. She made her way to the station's administrative center, where she would need to file formal reports about the incident. The corridors here were cleaner and better lit than the mining areas, with windows that provided views of the planet's stark, rocky surface. Sarah had always found the landscape beautiful in its harsh simplicity, and today the view seemed especially appropriate to her mood. The administrative staff looked up with interest as she entered the main office. Her reputation as a reliable, low-maintenance employee meant that her appearance in the administrative center was unusual and probably significant. "I need to file an incident report," Sarah told the receptionist, a young human woman named Lisa who had started working on the station just 6 months earlier. "What type of incident?" Lisa asked, then noticed Sarah's bandaged arm. "Oh my God, what happened?" "Workplace assault with a dangerous chemical," Sarah said calmly. "I'll need to speak with Station Manager Harrison and probably someone from corporate security." Lisa's eyes widened, and Sarah could see her mentally connecting the visible injury with the rumors that were undoubtedly already circulating through the station. I'll contact Manager Harrison right away." While she waited, Sarah used the office's computer terminal to begin documenting the incident. She kept her report factual and objective, focusing on the sequence of events rather than her emotional responses or speculations about Krextor's motivations. Corporate investigators would want clear, verifiable information rather than personal opinions. Station Manager Harrison arrived within 15 minutes, looking concerned and slightly frazzled. Robert Harrison was a career administrator who had managed mining operations on 7 different worlds, but he had never dealt with anything quite like the situation developing on Kepler 442b. "Sarah, Lisa said you were attacked? What exactly happened?" Sarah provided a concise summary of the confrontation with Krextor, from the initial quality control discussion to the acid attack, and her subsequent response. Harrison listened with growing concern, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "You neutralized his arms using pressure point techniques?" Harrison asked. "Where did you learn that kind of combat training?" "My father was a Marine," Sarah replied. "He believed everyone should know how to defend themselves. I never thought I'd need to use what he taught me, but it turned out to be relevant." Harrison made notes on his tablet, clearly struggling with the complexity of the situation. "This is going to require a full corporate investigation. Assault with a dangerous chemical is a serious felony under interstellar law, but there are also questions about your response and the cultural factors involved." "I acted in self-defense," Sarah said. "Krextor attacked me with a weapon, and I defended myself using minimal necessary force. The fact that he's larger and stronger doesn't give him the right to assault other workers." "No, it doesn't," Harrison agreed. "But this is going to create significant complications for station operations. The Zarkonians are a substantial part of our workforce, and their cultural concepts of honor and dominance make this kind of incident particularly problematic." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "Are you saying I should have allowed him to continue attacking me?" "Of course not," Harrison said quickly. "I'm saying that we need to find a way to resolve this that maintains station security and workforce stability while ensuring everyone's safety." "That's simple," Sarah replied. "Enforce the same rules for everyone. If assault is prohibited for humans, it's prohibited for Zarkonians. If quality control procedures are mandatory for humans, they're mandatory for Zarkonians. Equal treatment eliminates most of the complications. Harrison nodded, but Sarah could see him calculating the political ramifications. The mining consortium prized productivity above almost everything else, and alienating a significant portion of the workforce could have serious economic consequences. "I'll need to contact corporate headquarters," Harrison said finally. "This level of incident requires executive review. In the meantime, I'm placing both you and Krextor on administrative leave pending the investigation." Sarah had expected this, but it still meant she would be confined to her quarters or the common areas while investigators reviewed the incident. For someone who had worked every day for 3 years, the forced inactivity would be difficult to handle. "How long will the investigation take?" she asked. "Probably several weeks," Harrison replied. "Corporate will want to review station security footage, interview witnesses, and assess the cultural and legal implications. They might also bring in outside mediators to address the underlying tensions between different species." Sarah stood to leave, then paused. "Manager Harrison, one thing to keep in mind during the investigation. This didn't happen because I'm confrontational or because I enjoy conflict. It happened because someone thought they could intimidate and assault a human worker without consequences. Whether they'll be correct about that is now up to you and corporate management." Harrison watched her leave, clearly understanding the implicit warning. How the mining consortium handled this incident would send a message to every worker on the station about what behavior would be tolerated and what would be punished. As Sarah walked back to her quarters, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the course of a single shift. This morning she had been a quiet, competent drill operator focused on doing her job and avoiding trouble. Tonight she was at the center of a major interspecies incident that could affect policy for the entire mining consortium. The corridor leading to the residential section was unusually crowded, with workers gathering in small groups to discuss the day's events. Sarah noticed that the groups were largely segregated by species, with humans clustering together separately from the various alien workers. The normal casual mixing that characterized off-duty social interaction had been replaced by something more guarded and tribal. Several human workers approached her as she walked, offering support and expressing admiration for her actions. Their praise was gratifying, but Sarah understood that it came with implicit expectations. She had become a symbol of human resistance to alien intimidation, whether she wanted that role or not. "Sarah," called a familiar voice. She turned to see Marcus Webb, another drill operator who had worked on the station for 5 years. "Are you okay? The whole station is talking about what happened." "I'm fine," Sarah replied. "Hurt, but functional." "What are people saying?" Marcus glanced around, then lowered his voice. "The humans are calling you a hero. They're saying it's about time someone stood up to Zarkonian bullying. But the aliens, they're nervous. Some of them think this could lead to serious problems." Sarah nodded. She had anticipated this kind of polarization. "What about the Zarkonians themselves?" "They're mostly staying in their quarters," Marcus said. "But word is that Krextor is claiming he was provoked and that your response was excessive. Some of them are talking about filing countercomplaints." "Let them," Sarah said. "I documented everything carefully, and there are plenty of witnesses. The security cameras recorded the whole incident. If they want to claim I was the aggressor, they'll have to explain why I approached him with my hands empty while he was holding an acid applicator." Marcus looked relieved. "Good, because there's something else you should know. Some of the human workers are talking about organizing. They want to form a human workers' union to protect against alien intimidation." Sarah felt a chill of concern. While she supported workers' rights in principle, the formation of species-based unions could escalate tensions dramatically and potentially lead to the very conflicts everyone wanted to avoid. "That's their choice," she said carefully. "But they should think through the consequences. The mining consortium won't appreciate anything that disrupts productivity or creates legal complications." "They're scared," Marcus replied. "Today's incident reminded everyone how vulnerable we are. If Krextor could attack you with acid and expect to get away with it, what's stopping other aliens from similar behavior?" It was a valid concern, and Sarah didn't have a good answer. Her victory over Krextor might deter future attacks, or it might provoke escalation as other species tested human resolve. The next few weeks would determine which direction the situation developed. Tell them to be smart about whatever they do, Sarah said finally. Emotional responses usually make bad situations worse. If they want to organize, they should focus on legitimate workplace issues and use proper channels. Marcus nodded and continued down the corridor, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts as she approached her quarters. The small apartment was Spartan but comfortable, with a bed, desk, entertainment system, and a window that provided another view of the planet's rocky landscape. Sarah sat on her bed and carefully examined her bandaged arm. The pain had settled into a steady throb that would probably continue for weeks, and she could already feel the stiffness that would result from the healing process. The scars would be permanent reminders of the day her life changed direction. But, despite the pain and uncertainty, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of agency. For 3 years she had endured Krextor's harassment and intimidation because she believed she had no choice. Today she had discovered that choice always existed, even when the options were dangerous and the consequences uncertain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the investigation began, and various factions on the station chose sides. There would be pressure to apologize, to compromise, to find middle ground that would allow everyone to save face. Some people would want her to be a symbol of human strength, while others would prefer that she disappear quietly to avoid further complications. But tonight, as she looked out at the alien stars shining over an alien world, Sarah Chun felt something approaching satisfaction. She had been tested under fire and had not broken. Whatever came next, she would face it with the knowledge that when the moment of truth arrived, she had found the strength to fight back. The mining station continued its endless cycle of extraction and processing, but the balance of power had shifted in ways that would reshape relationships for months or years to come. And at the center of that change was a small human woman with acid burns on her arm and steel in her spine. 3 days after the acid attack, corporate investigator Diana Torres arrived on Kepler 442b aboard the weekly supply transport. Torres was a specialist in interspecies workplace conflicts, a field that had become increasingly important as human-led mining operations expanded into regions dominated by other civilizations. Her reputation for thorough, impartial investigations had made her the go-to choice for incidents that could affect corporate policy across multiple star systems. Sarah watched the transport dock from the observation deck of the residential section, noting the increased security presence around the landing bay. Station Manager Harrison had warned all workers that the investigation would be comprehensive and that everyone should be prepared for extensive interviews and document reviews. Over the past 3 days, the atmosphere on the station had remained tense but stable. Krextor had been confined to quarters pending the investigation, while the other Zarkonian workers had maintained a careful distance from human personnel. There had been no additional incidents, but the normal casual interaction between species had been replaced by formal, guarded exchanges that suggested deeper problems beneath the surface. Sarah's arm was healing faster than expected, thanks to the advanced medical treatments available on the station. The worst of the pain had subsided, though she still experienced periodic throbbing when she moved carelessly. More concerning were the psychological aftereffects. She found herself constantly scanning her environment for potential threats and had difficulty sleeping despite the pain medication Dr. Yates had prescribed. A message chime from her quarters communication system interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Chun, this is Investigator Torres. I'd like to schedule an interview at your earliest convenience. Please contact the administrative center to arrange a time." Sarah made her way to the administrative center, where she found a flurry of activity unusual for the normally quiet bureaucratic hub. Several corporate security officers had established a temporary office in one of the conference rooms, while station personnel hurried back and forth carrying files and data tablets. Lisa, the young receptionist, looked overwhelmed by the increased activity. "Sarah, Investigator Torres wants to see you this afternoon. She's already interviewed Manager Harrison and several of the witnesses." "How long are these interviews taking?" Sarah asked. "About 2 hours each," Lisa replied. "She's very thorough. She has access to all the security footage and personnel records, and She's asking really detailed questions about workplace relationships and cultural tensions. Sarah nodded and scheduled her interview for later that afternoon, then returned to her quarters to prepare. She reviewed her written report and considered how to present the incident in a way that emphasized the facts while explaining her motivations and responses. The interview room was one of the station's smaller conference spaces, equipped with recording equipment and a large display screen that Torres was using to review security footage. The investigator was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. "Ms. Chun, thank you for coming," Torres said. "I've reviewed your written report and the security footage, but I'd like to hear your account of the incident in your own words." Sarah provided a detailed chronology of events, from her discovery of the quality control discrepancies to the final confrontation with Krextor. Torres listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on her tablet. "You mentioned that you had expected something like this for a long time," Torres said when Sarah finished. "Can you elaborate on that?" "Krextor had been escalating his harassment over several months," Sarah explained. "It started with dismissive comments and gradually became more openly hostile. I documented several incidents where he refused to follow safety protocols or deliberately interfered with workflow efficiency." Torres brought up a file on her screen. "I see you filed 3 formal complaints over the past year, but no disciplinary action was taken. How did that affect your assessment of the situation?" "It told me that management was unwilling or unable to address the problem through normal channels," Sarah replied. "Krextor learned that there were no consequences for his behavior, which encouraged him to become more aggressive. Did you consider requesting a transfer to a different section?" Sarah had anticipated this question. "I considered it, but I was assigned to Section 7 because of my expertise with the geological formations there. Moving to a different section would have meant accepting less challenging work and probably lower compensation. I didn't think I should have to sacrifice my career advancement because someone else couldn't behave professionally." Torres nodded and made more notes. "Let's talk about your response to the acid attack. You used what you described as pressure point techniques to neutralize Krextor's arms. Where did you learn these skills?" "My father served in the Colonial Marines," Sarah said. "He taught me basic self-defense techniques when I was growing up. He believed everyone should know how to protect themselves, especially people planning to work in remote locations." "Had you ever used these techniques before?" "Never in a real situation," Sarah admitted. "But I had practiced them regularly as a form of exercise. When Krextor attacked me, muscle memory took over." Torres pulled up a section of security footage showing the moment when Sarah struck Krextor's nerve cluster. "This appears to have been a very precise and effective technique. Did you know it would cause temporary paralysis?" "I knew it would cause pain and temporary loss of motor control," Sarah replied. "I didn't know the exact duration or extent of the effect. My goal was to stop his attack and prevent him from using the acid applicator again." "Why didn't you try to escape instead of confronting him?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "The tunnel was too confined for effective evasion, and running would have encouraged pursuit. Krextor was faster and stronger than me, so flight would have put me at a greater disadvantage. Attacking was the only option that gave me a chance to control the outcome." Torres reviewed more footage, showing Sarah holding the acid applicator on the disabled Zarkonian. At this point, Krextor was no longer an immediate threat. "Why didn't you simply call for security?" "Because the immediate threat was only part of the problem," Sarah said. "Krextor's attack was an escalation of behavior that had been building for months. If I had simply called security and let them handle it, he would have learned that acid attacks on human workers have minimal consequences. The next incident might have been worse." "So your goal was to deter future attacks?" "My goal was to survive and ensure that survival didn't require constantly looking over my shoulder for the next assault." Torres spent the next hour reviewing specific details of the incident, cross-referencing Sarah's account with witness statements and security footage. She was particularly interested in the quality control issues that had triggered the initial confrontation. "I've examined the ore samples from Krextor's section," Torres said. "Your assessment was correct. There were significant purity variations that suggest improper sorting procedures. Did you suspect deliberate sabotage?" "I suspected carelessness or poor training," Sarah replied. Deliberate sabotage seemed less likely because it would hurt Crextor's productivity ratings. I thought he was cutting corners to speed up his work. But you persisted in confronting him even when he became obviously hostile. Why not simply report the quality issues to management and let them handle it? Sarah paused, considering how to explain her decision. Because I had already learned that management preferred to avoid confrontations with difficult employees. The quality issues would have been quietly ignored or minimized to maintain productivity. Meanwhile, Crextor would have learned that his intimidation tactics were effective. So you felt that direct confrontation was necessary? I felt that someone needed to enforce standards consistently, regardless of the personalities involved. If the mining consortium wants high quality and safe working conditions, they need to support supervisors who maintain those standards. Torres made additional notes, then shifted to questions about the broader cultural dynamics on the station. How would you describe the general relationship between human and Zarkonian workers? Tense but functional, Sarah said. Most Zarkonians view humans as inferior, but they're willing to work with us when it's necessary. Most humans try to avoid unnecessary conflict while maintaining their professional responsibilities. Has this incident changed those dynamics? Definitely. There's much less casual interaction between species now. People are more guarded and formal. Some human workers have talked about organizing for protection, while some aliens seem to be reassessing how they interact with human supervisors. Do you think the changes are positive or negative? Sarah considered the question. Mixed. The increased formality reduces friction in some ways, but it also reduces the collaborative relationships that make mining operations more efficient. Long-term, the station needs to find better ways to address cultural conflicts before they escalate to violence. Torres wrapped up the interview by asking about Sarah's expectations for the outcome of the investigation. What do you think should happen to Crextor? He should face appropriate consequences for assault with a dangerous chemical, Sarah replied. Whether that's criminal prosecution, termination, or transfer depends on corporate policy and legal requirements. But there should be consequences. And what about your own future on the station? I'd like to continue my work here, assuming the safety and cultural issues can be addressed. I'm good at my job, and I enjoy the technical challenges of deep space mining. I don't want to be transferred just because someone else couldn't handle professional supervision. After the interview, Sarah returned to her quarters to find a message from Marcus Webb asking her to meet him in the recreation area. The rec area was one of the few spaces on the station where different species normally socialize together. But today it was nearly deserted except for a small group of human workers clustered around a corner table. Sarah, we need to talk, Marcus said as she approached. Things are developing faster than we expected. The group included most of the senior human workers on the station, drill operators, equipment technicians, and shift supervisors who collectively represented decades of mining experience. Their expressions were serious, and Sarah could see the tension in their body language. What's happening? She asked, taking a seat. Torres has been asking a lot of questions about workplace harassment and discrimination, said Janet Morrison, a veteran equipment technician. Not just about your incident, but about patterns of behavior over the past year. She's building a case that the problems go beyond one bad actor. That's good, isn't it? Sarah said. If there are systemic issues, they should be addressed. Maybe, Marcus replied. But Torres also asked about our discussion regarding a human workers' union. Someone must have mentioned it to her. Sarah felt a surge of concern. What did you tell her? The truth, Janet said. That we've been discussing ways to protect ourselves from harassment and intimidation. But Torres seemed to think that kind of organizing could make the cultural tensions worse. She's probably right, Sarah admitted. Species-based unions could lead to the exact kind of polarization that creates more conflicts. So what's the alternative? Asked Tom Bradley, a shift supervisor. We tried the individual complaint process, and that didn't work. Management ignored the problems until someone got hurt. If we can't organize for protection, and we can't rely on management support, what options do we have? It was a fair question, and Sarah didn't have a good answer. The incident with Crextor had highlighted the fundamental vulnerability of human workers in a mixed-species environment where physical intimidation could be used as a tool of workplace control. Maybe the answer isn't human-only organizing, she said finally. Maybe we need to build coalitions with other species who face similar problems. Like who? Marcus asked. The Centaurians have had issues with Zarkonian bullying, Sarah replied. So have some of the Altarian workers. If we approach this as a general workplace safety issue rather than a human versus alien issue, we might get broader support. The group considered this, but Sarah could see skepticism in several faces. The immediate instinct after a crisis was to circle the wagons and focus on protecting one's own group, not to build complex political alliances. That's a longer-term strategy, Janet pointed out. What about immediate protection? What happens when you and Krextor both come back to work after the investigation? Do you think he's going to just forget what happened? Sarah had been wrestling with the same question. Zarkonian culture emphasized honor and revenge, and Krextor's humiliation would not be easily forgiven or forgotten. Even if he were transferred to a different section, other Zarkonians might feel obligated to restore their colleagues' honor through retaliation. I think the investigation results will determine that, she said. If corporate takes strong action and makes it clear that attacks on human workers will have severe consequences, it might deter future problems. If they try to minimize the incident or find middle ground that lets everyone save face, we're probably headed for escalation. The discussion continued for another hour, with the group debating various scenarios and potential responses. By the end, they had agreed to hold off on formal organizing until the investigation was complete, but to maintain informal communication networks that would allow quick coordination if future incidents occurred. As the group dispersed, Sarah found herself walking back to her quarters with Tom Bradley, who had been one of her strongest supporters during her early days on the station. You know this has changed everything for you, Tom said as they walked. Whether the investigation goes well or badly, you're going to be marked as a troublemaker by some people and as a hero by others. That kind of visibility can be dangerous in a place like this. Sarah nodded. I know. But what was the alternative? Let Krextor burn my arm off and hope someone else would deal with the problem eventually. No, you did the right thing, Tom said. I'm just warning you that doing the right thing doesn't always lead to good outcomes. Corporate politics can be just as dangerous as alien harassment. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Yates knocked on her quarters door just as she was preparing for bed, carrying his medical kit and wearing an expression of professional concern. How's the arm? He asked as she let him in. Better. Less pain, good mobility. I've been following your treatment instructions. Dr. Yates examined the healing burns, nodding with satisfaction as he checked for signs of infection or complications. The tissue regeneration is proceeding well. You should have full function back within another week. Is that why you're here? Sarah asked. This could have waited until tomorrow. Dr. Yates finished his examination and packed his equipment, then sat down in the chair across from her bed. I wanted to discuss something that's not in my official reports. Something I noticed during your initial treatment. Sarah waited, sensing that this was about more than medical care. Your response to the acid attack was unusual, Dr. Yates continued. Most people who suffer that kind of assault experience significant psychological trauma. They have nightmares, anxiety attacks, difficulty concentrating. You've shown none of those symptoms. Maybe I'm just tougher than most people. Maybe, the doctor agreed. Or maybe you processed the trauma differently because you were able to fight back effectively. There's research suggesting that victims who successfully defend themselves against attacks suffer less long-term psychological damage. Sarah considered this. Is that what you think happened? I think you found a way to transform a traumatic experience into a victory, Dr. Yates said. That's psychologically powerful, but it can also create problems. Success in defending yourself once doesn't guarantee success the next time, and it can lead to overconfidence in dangerous situations. Are you worried that I'm going to start picking fights with Zarkonians? I'm worried that you might not recognize when it's time to back down, Dr. Yates replied. The technique you used on Krextor was effective, but it was also lucky. A slightly different angle or a faster response from him could have resulted in much worse injuries for you. Sarah appreciated the doctor's concern, but she disagreed with his assessment. It wasn't luck. It was training and preparation. My father taught me that technique specifically because it works on large opponents with heavy muscle mass. Your father fought other humans, Dr. Yates pointed out. Alien physiology can be unpredictable. The pressure point that disabled Krextor might not work on other species, and some aliens have natural defenses that could make hand-to-hand combat extremely dangerous. It was a valid warning, and Sarah filed it away for future consideration. But she also knew that the psychological benefits Dr. Yates had identified were real. For the first time in months, she felt like she had some control over her own safety and professional environment. "I'll be careful," she promised. "But I won't go back to being intimidated and harassed just to avoid potential danger." Dr. Yates nodded and left, but his warning stayed with Sarah as she tried to sleep. Her victory over Krextor had been satisfying, but it had also committed her to a path that might lead to escalating confrontations with increasingly dangerous opponents. The next morning brought news that would reshape the entire situation. Sarah was having breakfast in the commissary when Janet Morrison approached her table with a data tablet and an expression of barely controlled excitement. "You need to see this," Janet said, placing the tablet in front of Sarah. Torres found something in her investigation. The tablet displayed a corporate memo dated 6 months earlier, discussing productivity optimization strategies for mixed-species mining operations. The document recommended allowing natural dominance hierarchies to establish themselves and minimizing intervention in interpersonal conflicts that do not directly impact production quotas. "This is why management ignored your complaints," Janet explained. Corporate policy was to let strong workers intimidate weaker ones if it didn't hurt productivity. They were deliberately allowing workplace harassment as a management tool. Sarah read through the memo with growing anger. The document was carefully worded to avoid explicitly endorsing discrimination, but the implications were clear. The mining consortium had decided that maintaining productivity was more important than protecting workers from harassment and intimidation. Torres found this. Sarah asked. "She found this, and a lot more," Janet replied. Internal communications discussing cultural accommodation and species-appropriate supervision. The whole thing was a setup designed to keep labor costs down by encouraging workers to police each other instead of requiring actual management. The implications were staggering. Sarah's confrontation with Krextor hadn't been an isolated incident arising from personal animosity. It had been the inevitable result of corporate policies that deliberately created conditions for workplace harassment and violence. "What's Torres going to do with this?" Sarah asked. "She's expanding the investigation," Janet said. "Instead of just looking at your incident with Krextor, she's now examining the entire management structure and policy framework. This could result in major changes to how the consortium operates." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and concern. While she was pleased that the systemic nature of the problems would be addressed, she also understood that her role as the catalyst for this expanded investigation would make her even more visible and potentially more vulnerable. "There's something else," Janet continued. "Word is getting out to the other mining stations. Torres has authority to investigate corporate-wide policies, and other stations are reporting similar incidents. This could become a major scandal for the consortium." As if summoned by their conversation, Investigator Torres appeared at their table. "Miss Chun, could I speak with you privately?" Sarah followed Torres to a quiet corner of the commissary, where the investigator's expression was notably more serious than it had been during their previous meeting. "The scope of this investigation has changed significantly," Torres said without preamble. "What began as an isolated incident report has uncovered evidence of systematic policy violations and potential criminal negligence by corporate management." "What does that mean for me?" Sarah asked. "It means you're no longer just a victim and witness," Torres replied. "You're potentially a key plaintiff in a major corporate lawsuit. It also means that powerful people now have strong incentives to discredit your version of events or to pressure you into accepting settlements that would prevent further investigation." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She had gone from being a minor mining employee to being a threat to corporate executives whose careers and financial interests depended on containing the damage from this scandal. "What kind of pressure are you talking about?" she asked. "Transfer offers to premium positions on other worlds," Torres said. "Generous compensation packages with non-disclosure agreements. Potential intimidation through disciplinary actions or safety violations." the standard toolkit for silencing inconvenient whistleblowers. And if I don't cooperate, then you help me build a case that could result in criminal charges against multiple executives and major policy changes across the entire mining industry, Torres replied. But you also paint a target on your back that could follow you for years. Sarah looked around the commissary, noting the various species of workers eating their meals and conducting their daily routines in apparent normality. Most of them had no idea that their workplace had been deliberately designed to encourage harassment and intimidation, or that the policies governing their daily lives were about to be subjected to intensive legal scrutiny. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Torres smiled for the first time since they had met. "I need you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Be honest, be thorough, and don't let anyone convince you to minimize what happened or accept responsibility for other people's failures." As Torres walked away, Sarah realized that her simple desire to enforce quality control standards had evolved into something much larger and more complex. She was now at the center of a corporate scandal that could reshape employment policies across human space, and the choices she made in the coming weeks would affect not just her own future, but the safety and dignity of thousands of other workers. The morning that had begun with breakfast and routine updates had ended with the knowledge that her life had fundamentally changed once again. But unlike the changes that had been forced on her by Krextor's attack, these new developments were the result of her own choices and actions. For the first time since arriving on Kepler 442b, Sarah Chin felt like she was not just surviving her circumstances, but actively shaping them. 2 months after investigator Torres completed her expanded investigation, Sarah Chin stood in a conference room aboard the corporate flagship Meridian, preparing to testify before the Mining Consortium's board of directors. The room's windows provided a spectacular view of the Kepler system's binary stars, but Sarah's attention was focused on the panel of executives who would determine not just her own future, but the working conditions for thousands of employees across dozens of worlds. The investigation had uncovered a web of policy failures that extended far beyond the single incident on Kepler 442b. Torres had documented systematic harassment, discriminatory management practices, and deliberate corporate policies that encouraged workplace intimidation as a cost control measure. The evidence was overwhelming, and the legal implications were staggering. But powerful interests had mobilized to contain the damage. Corporate lawyers had challenged Torres's authority, questioned the validity of evidence, and attempted to characterize the problems as isolated incidents blown out of proportion by disgruntled employees. Several executives had resigned, but others were fighting to preserve their positions and limit the scope of any reforms. Sarah had spent the past month on Earth, working with Torres and a team of prosecutors to prepare for these hearings. The time away from Kepler 442b had given her perspective on how dramatically her life had changed, but it had also reinforced her determination to see the process through to its conclusion. "Ms. Chun," called Board Chairman Maxwell Hartley, "please state your current position for the record." "I am a senior drilling operator for the Kepler 442b mining station," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the formal surroundings. "I have held that position for 3 years and for months. And prior to the incident that triggered this investigation, how would you characterize your relationship with Zarkonian workers on the station?" Sarah had rehearsed this answer, but delivering it in front of the corporate leadership still required careful control. Professional, but tense. Most Zarkonian workers viewed human supervisors as illegitimate authorities and made minimal effort to follow safety protocols or quality standards when supervised by humans. "Did you report these issues to station management?" "Multiple times," Sarah confirmed. "I filed 14 formal complaints over 18 months, documenting safety violations, quality control failures, and workplace harassment. No disciplinary actions were taken in response to any of these reports." Board member Elena Vasquez leaned forward. "Ms. Chun, is it possible that your complaints were considered excessive or unreasonable by management?" Sarah met her eyes directly. The investigation found that similar complaints were being filed by human supervisors on 17 different mining stations across 4-star systems. Unless you believe that human workers throughout the consortium simultaneously became unreasonably demanding, The pattern suggests systematic management failures rather than individual personality conflicts. Vasquez made notes on her tablet, clearly unhappy with Sarah's prepared response. The board had hoped to characterize the problems as isolated incidents, but Torres's investigation had made such claims impossible to sustain. Let's discuss the specific incident involving Zarkonian worker Krextor. Chairman Hartley continued. Walk us through the events that led to the physical confrontation. Sarah provided a detailed account of the quality control discussion that had escalated into violence. She had told this story dozens of times now, but each repetition reinforced her awareness of how preventable the entire situation had been. You stated that Krextor's response to your quality control concerns was to attack you with industrial acid, Hartley said. Did you consider this response proportional to your criticism of his work? I considered it attempted assault with a dangerous chemical, Sarah replied. The proportionality question should be directed to Krextor and the corporate policies that convinced him such behavior would be tolerated. Board member James Morrison, clearly frustrated with Sarah's refusal to accept partial responsibility, tried a different approach. Ms. Chun, your response to the acid attack was to physically disable your attacker and threaten him with his own weapon. Don't you think that level of violence was excessive? Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared her answer carefully. Board member Morrison, if someone throws acid on your arm and prepares to continue the attack, what level of response do you consider appropriate? Should I have asked him politely to stop? Should I have filed a complaint and waited for management to address it in 6 months? You could have called for security. Security response time to the deep mining sections averages 8 minutes, Sarah replied. Krextor could have blinded or killed me in 30 seconds. When someone attacks you with acid, you don't have the luxury of committee meetings to determine the appropriate response. The questioning continued for 2 hours, with board members attempting to establish that Sarah had been unnecessarily confrontational, that management had acted reasonably given the information available, and that the systematic policy failures documented by Torres were either overstated or the result of misunderstood cultural accommodation efforts. Sarah answered each question with facts, documentation, and the calm confidence that came from knowing she had acted correctly throughout the entire sequence of events. She had learned from Torres that corporate investigations often became exercises in blame shifting, where executives tried to find scapegoats for systemic failures rather than accepting responsibility for policy decisions. Ms. Chun, Chairman Hartley said as the questioning phase concluded, what outcome do you expect from these proceedings? I expect the consortium to implement policies that protect all workers from harassment and violence, Sarah replied. I expect management to enforce safety and quality standards consistently regardless of species or cultural background. And I expect accountability for the executives who created policies that deliberately endangered workers to reduce labor costs. And if the board determines that current policies are adequate and that this incident was an unfortunate isolated occurrence. Sarah considered her response carefully. This was the moment when she would either accept a corporate whitewash or commit fully to the fight for meaningful reform. Then, I will continue working with federal prosecutors on the criminal charges pending against multiple consortium executives, she said. Industrial safety violations that result in worker injuries are felonies under interstellar law, and the evidence gathered during this investigation supports prosecution for conspiracy, negligent endangerment, and violations of interspecies employment statutes. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. The criminal investigation was proceeding parallel to the corporate hearings, and several executives were already facing potential prison sentences if the prosecution was successful. Thank you, Ms. Chun, Hartley said. The board will deliberate and announce our decisions within the next week. As Sarah left the conference room, she was met by Torres and federal prosecutor Amanda Chun, who had been monitoring the proceedings from an adjacent room. You did well in there, Torres said. They tried every standard technique for discrediting witness testimony, but you stayed focused on the facts. How do you think they'll rule? Sarah asked. They're trapped, Prosecutor Chun replied. The evidence is too overwhelming to ignore, and the criminal investigation gives us leverage they can't counter with internal corporate politics. They'll probably implement significant policy changes, and sacrifice a few executives to demonstrate accountability. What about Krextor? He's been terminated and deported back to the Zarkonian home system, Torres said. He's also facing assault charges there, assuming their government decides to prosecute. The Zarkonian ambassador has been cooperative. Apparently, they're concerned about the diplomatic implications of widespread workplace violence by their citizens. Sarah nodded, though she felt little satisfaction from Krextor's punishment. The individual accountability was less important than the systemic changes needed to prevent future incidents. 3 days later, the consortium announced a comprehensive package of policy reforms. All mining stations would implement standardized harassment reporting procedures with mandatory investigation timelines. Species-based cultural accommodation policies would be replaced with universal workplace conduct standards. Management personnel would receive training in interspecies conflict resolution, and workers would have access to independent advocacy services. Most importantly, the consortium accepted legal liability for the policy failures that had enabled workplace violence and agreed to establish a compensation fund for affected workers. Several executives were terminated, and others faced criminal prosecution for their roles in creating and maintaining the discriminatory policies. Sarah received a formal apology from the board of directors and an offer to transfer to any position in the consortium at her current salary level or higher. She also received a substantial financial settlement that would provide security for years to come. But the most significant change was cultural. The consortium's acknowledgement that human workers deserved equal protection and respect had ripple effects throughout the mining industry. Other corporations revised their own policies to avoid similar legal exposure, and interspecies workplace advocacy groups gained funding and political support for their reform efforts. 6 months later, Sarah stood once again in the mining tunnels of Kepler 442b, but the environment had been transformed. The new policies had eliminated most of the casual harassment and intimidation that had previously characterized interspecies interactions. Workers still focused primarily on their own species groups during social time, but professional relationships had become genuinely collaborative. The quality control issues that had triggered the original confrontation were now addressed through systematic training programs and clear procedural guidelines. No worker, regardless of species or size, had to choose between enforcing standards and risking personal safety. Sarah had been promoted to shift supervisor with authority over multiple sections, a position that required her to manage both human and alien workers. The transition had been challenging, but the new corporate policies provided clear frameworks for resolving conflicts before they escalated to violence. Sarah called Marcus Webb as he approached her workstation. The new Centaurian workers want to meet with you about the section assignment procedures. Sarah looked up from her geological survey reports, noting the respectful tone that had become standard for professional interactions. Any specific concerns? They're worried about being assigned to teams with Zarkonians, Marcus replied. Apparently, there have been some tensions on other stations. It was exactly the kind of issue that had previously been ignored or mismanaged, leading to escalating conflicts and eventual violence. But now there were established procedures for addressing cultural compatibility in team assignments, and Sarah had the authority and training needed to resolve the situation effectively. Set up a meeting for this afternoon, Sarah said. We'll review the assignment criteria and see if we can address their concerns without compromising operational efficiency. As Marcus left to arrange the meeting, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when she had first confronted Krextor about quality control issues. The path from drilling operator to corporate whistleblower to interspecies conflict resolution specialist had not been one she had chosen, but it had taught her capabilities she never knew she possessed. The acid scars on her left arm had faded to thin white lines that were barely visible unless someone looked closely. But they served as a permanent reminder of the day she had learned that survival sometimes required fighting back against overwhelming odds. Her personal victory over Krextor had been satisfying, but the systematic changes that followed had been far more important. Thousands of workers across dozens of worlds now had protections and advocacy resources that hadn't existed before, and workplace violence had become a career-ending offense rather than a tolerated form of cultural expression. Sarah's data tablet chimed with an incoming message from Dr. Yates, who had been monitoring her psychological health throughout the extended legal proceedings. His reports had documented her successful adaptation to increased responsibilities and her development of leadership skills in high-stress environments. Quarterly evaluation scheduled for next week, the message read. All indicators suggest continued positive adjustment and professional growth. Recommend consideration for advanced management training programs. Sarah smiled as she read the message. 6 months ago, she had been focused on simply surviving her shift assignments and avoiding confrontation. Now she was being recommended for training that would prepare her for senior management positions throughout the consortium. The transformation had not been easy. The legal proceedings had been stressful and time-consuming, and the constant media attention had been difficult to handle. Several death threats from Zarkonian extremists had required security protection, and the pressure to accept corporate settlement offers rather than pursuing full accountability had been intense. But Sarah had learned that backing down from necessary fights only led to bigger fights later. The courage required to defend yourself with acid burning through your arm was the same courage needed to testify before corporate boards and federal prosecutors. Once you discovered you possessed that courage, it became a resource you could draw upon whenever circumstances required it. As her shift ended, Sarah walked through the residential section of the mining station, observing the changes that had occurred since the investigation concluded. The recreation areas now hosted mixed-species social events that had been unthinkable a year earlier. The commissary had expanded its food service to accommodate different dietary requirements, creating opportunities for cultural exchange rather than sources of tension. Most importantly, the constant undercurrent of fear that had characterized daily life for human workers had been replaced by confidence that problems could be addressed through established channels rather than personal confrontation. Workers still faced the normal hazards of deep space mining, but they no longer had to worry about harassment and intimidation from their colleagues. Sarah's quarters had been upgraded as part of her promotion, providing more space and better amenities. But the most valuable change was psychological. For the first time since arriving on Kepler 442b, she could go to sleep without wondering what threats tomorrow might bring. A soft knock on her door interrupted her evening routine. She opened it to find Lisa, the young receptionist who had been working in the administrative center when the crisis began. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you before my shift transfer," Lisa said. "If you hadn't stood up to Krextor, I would probably still be dealing with harassment from half a dozen alien workers who thought humans were easy targets." "You're transferring?" Sarah asked. "Promotion to assistant station manager on Vega 7, Lisa replied with obvious pride. "The new diversity initiative is creating opportunities for qualified human workers throughout the consortium. 2 years ago, I would never have been considered for management track positions." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that was deeper and more lasting than anything she had experienced during her physical confrontation with Krextor. Individual victories were important, but systematic change that improved conditions for everyone was the real measure of success. After Lisa left, Sarah stood at her quarters window, looking out at the alien stars that had become familiar over her years on the mining station. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to apply the lessons learned from her confrontation with workplace harassment and violence. But tonight, she allowed herself to appreciate how far she had come from the frightened drill operator who had once endured daily intimidation because she believed she had no choice. The woman who had thrown acid on her arm had discovered that choice always existed, even when the options were dangerous and the consequences uncertain. And in choosing to fight back instead of accepting victimhood, Sarah Chun had not only saved herself, but had helped create a safer and more just workplace for thousands of other people who would never know her name, but would benefit from her courage. The mining station continued its endless cycle of extraction and processing, but the workers who powered that cycle now did so with dignity and security that their predecessors had been denied. And at the heart of that transformation was a simple truth that Sarah had learned with acid burning through her arm. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or words, but with the determination to stand up for yourself and others when standing up seems impossible. The stars of the Kepler system shone down on a mining operation that had become a model for interspecies cooperation and mutual respect, proving that even the most entrenched systems of harassment and intimidation could be changed when someone found the courage to say no more and the strength to make that refusal stick. In the years that followed, Sarah's story would be told throughout human space as an example of how individual courage could create systematic change. Mining academies would teach case studies based on the Kepler 442b reforms, and workplace advocates would use her testimony to argue for stronger protections in other industries. But for Sarah herself, the greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that workers throughout the consortium could now go to their jobs without fear, secure in the knowledge that harassment and violence would not be tolerated regardless of species or cultural background. The alien brute who had thrown acid on her arm had intended to teach her a lesson about power and submission. Instead, he had taught her about her own strength and the importance of using that strength not just for personal survival, but for the protection and advancement of everyone who shared her commitment to dignity and justice in the workplace. The lesson had been painful, but it had been worth learning. And in applying that lesson with courage and determination, Sarah Chun had proven that humans belonged not just in the dangerous tunnels of deep space mining operations, but in the leadership positions that determined how those operations were conducted and how the people who powered them were treated. The acid scars on her arm had healed, but the strength they represented would last forever.